Depending on who you ask, Terminator 2 Judgment Day is either one of the best action movies ever, one of the best movies in any genre period, or just the best movie of all time, full stop. But regardless of how you rank it, between all the robots, lasers, explosions, chase sequences, boss fights, and guns, of which there are a whole lot, there's no debate that this film lends itself to games. So naturally, it's gotten its share of adaptation. Some have tried to translate the Terminator franchise's most explosive moments into an interactive experience.
The first PC game to ever do it.
Some have woven original lore into the series' tangled rat's nest of a timeline. And some aren't actually connected to this universe at all.
Remember, music is the weapon.
But figured it couldn't hurt to throw a killer robot or two into the mix.
Get over here.
But alas, there's never been a definitive T2 video game. But this year, Terminator 2D No Fate is attempting to change that. Much like an advanced cybernetic organism sent back in time to alter the future, a group of game developers is using cutting-edge technology from the year 2025 to make the Judgment Day game we've wanted ever since the movie was released back in 1991.
Come with me if you want to live.
So come with me if you want to learn about the best, worst, and weirdest Terminator video games ever made, in this timeline at least. But please, keep your pants on, it's not that kind of time travel. One of the best things about Terminator 2 is the sheer variety of its action scenes. It's got multiple chase sequences with cars, bikes, trucks, and a chopper. In between chases, it's got shootouts that make use of a whole arsenal of distinctive weapons, and it pits a nearly unkillable protagonist against an even less killable villain. If that wasn't enough, there's a nice glimpse of future warfare full of flying laser robots and cyber tanks and chrome-plated skeleton men. Now imagine that you're tasked with combining all of those things into an interactive experience that's as fun to play as it was to watch on the big screen, and also, it's gotta fit on a floppy disk. And by the way, you're on a tight deadline to get it shipped while the movie is still fresh in people's minds. And one last little detail, you haven't actually seen the movie yourself. While that was the case for several of the Terminator 2 video games that gradually trickled out in the 2 years following its theatrical release. Before hitting theaters, T2 was a closely guarded secret, so while the developers were allowed to read a draft of the script and see relevant reference materials, they had to fill in a lot of blanks, figuring out how the finished product would actually look. So they weren't exactly flying blind, but they were definitely gunning it down the freeway full speed with their headlights turned off, and it shows in those earlier games. The T2 game that suffered the worst from these circumstances was Ocean Software's officially licensed Cash Grab, released exclusively in PAL territory in time for the film's European theatrical release. This one is such a bizarre mess that IGN's sister site Eurogamer produced a whole video all about it, titled The Terminator 2 Game That's Very Weird. And while that's an apt appraisal of that game in particular, there are quite a few others that also fit the same description and were developed under equally challenging conditions. Stateside, one of the first T2 games to market was for Game Boy, released in time for the holiday shopping season of '91. It did an admirable job compressing the explosive events depicted on the big screen onto a monochromatic chartreuse display the size of a sugar packet. Like Ocean's version, it too featured a mix of side-scrolling run-and-gun platforming levels and on-rails driving sequences. In between, there were multiple circuit puzzles in which the player had to reprogram the Terminator, just like in that unforgettable scene in the film where John and Sarah Connor void the T-800's warranty by tinkering with the CPU.
You can now access the CPU.
Unfortunately, unbeknownst to the developers as they scrambled to make a game based on a movie they hadn't seen yet, that scene would get cut for the theatrical release. The circuit levels are definitely more filler than they are killer, but they probably seemed especially phoned in to players at the time who didn't have that context. It's funny to think about a movie studio splitting hairs about actors' likenesses on a screen with such low fidelity, but it was genuinely a bone of contention. Arnold Schwarzenegger's likeness couldn't be used for the T-800 in-game, something that's still the case for Terminator 2D, so there are no digitized close-up images to be found on the Game Boy cartridge. It's possible that's why his character sprite looks more like Sigourney Weaver in Aliens than it does Arnold in T2, but that's more likely a byproduct of it being 20 pixels tall. Monochromatic low-res renditions of John and Sarah Connor do appear briefly to explain the story, and apparently Linda Hamilton's portrait in particular was the cause of some confusion. In an interview years later, it was revealed that UK-based developer Bits received feedback from T2's production company that Sarah Connor's bangs weren't big enough. They were referring to the hair that covers her forehead, but in the UK, that's called fringe, so the developers briefly thought this was American slang for breasts. Thankfully, based on the finished product, this mix-up eventually got sorted out. In 1992, a similarly shaped Terminator 2 game made its way onto the NES before getting ported to the Sega Master System and the Game Gear. Like the Game Boy version, this broke up the movie into side-scrolling platforming levels and driving sequences, but thankfully it scrapped the circuitry puzzles, suggesting that the developers of this version were actually able to see the film they were making a game about. While it's a fairly boilerplate video game tie-in for the era, there is one rather ingenious wrinkle. Just like in the movie, John Connor gives his pet Terminator a scolding for terminating too many people, and this is reflected in-game by requiring the player to complete the mental hospital level non-lethally. Shooting human enemies while standing will result in a mission failure, so the player is forced to crouch and shoot them in the legs instead. Pretty clever, but also probably kind of infuriating. In December 1993, Terminator 2 games finally arrived on the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. These versions benefited from the more powerful hardware and extra development time, but they didn't exactly strike while the steel was still molten. By the time they were released, time-traveling robots from the future had become obsolete, and genetically resuscitated dinosaurs ruled the world, following Jurassic Park's box office success that summer. Despite featuring larger, more varied environments and side objectives like collecting scattered future tech, the 16-bit T2 was not received well. Aside from frustrating players mechanically, it also underwhelmed visually, especially when compared to the other console games on store shelves at the time like Echo the Dolphin and Star Fox, or ports of arcade hits like Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat. That said, you do have to give it a little bit of credit for authentically starting the first level with a butt-naked Terminator walking into a biker bar.
Hey bro, I'm gonna get some quarters. I'll be back, alright? Cool.
Considering that T2 shows the future savior of humanity gleefully burning through ill-gotten tokens and afterburner and missile defense at his local arcade, it's only fitting that the film get an arcade game of its own.
I am the future. Fire at will.
This started appearing in arcades in 1991 when the film had barely left cinemas. Compared to the scattershot attempt the console games made at distilling the film's action set pieces to an interactive format, the original arcade game was more of a straight shooter, as in, all you did was shoot stuff that was straight in front of you. An on-rail shooting gallery played with cabinet-mounted light guns, T2, the arcade game, let up to 2 players take on the role of the T-800. The score screen would refer to each player as an individual Terminator, though it makes more sense canonically to pretend that each player is controlling one of the T-800's arms. After all, in the movies, he cocks a shotgun one-handed and dual-wields assault rifles, so that checks out. In fact, you can actually play this game while dual-wielding yourself, poorly. So if you have a couple rolls of quarters you really need to get rid of quickly, that's one option. The first 5 levels of the arcade game take place in 2029, the near-future hellscape ravaged by the Skynet and Resistance War depicted at the start of Judgment Day. There, players blasted wave after wave of endoskeletons, including higher-level gold-plated ones, before eventually getting sent back in time to shoot stuff in the 1990s. The first 90s level takes place in the Cyberdyne offices, where the primary objective is destroy everything, which includes dozens of Cyberdyne Systems staff members in hazmat suits inexplicably hurling Erlenmeyer flasks full of chemicals at you. Why do they have chemistry stuff here? This is a software company. One of the big selling points of the arcade game is that it used the digitized likenesses of Arnold Schwarzenegger, Edward Furlong, and Robert Patrick, as well as authentic audio clips from the movie. Of course, the context in which these clips are used is slightly less authentic. When the T-1000 finally shows up at the end of the Cyberdyne level, he delivers this chilling one-liner.
Are you John Connor?
Which is extremely funny, as it suggests that he's still not 100% certain this child he's come all this way to kill is in fact the guy he's after. Like the movie, the final showdown takes place in a steel mill, and the T-1000 must be doused with liquid nitrogen and shattered, and then ultimately knocked into a vat of molten metal. However, unlike the movie, in between those sequences, the T-800 must protect John Connor from a bunch of gun-toting steel mill workers who come rappelling from the ceiling, who are apparently really unhappy about this robot fight interrupting their smelting of ingots or rebar production or whatever it is they do in that factory. T2 the arcade game isn't perfect, but it could have been a lot worse. It could have been about rescuing Aerosmith by launching CDs at stormtroopers who are dressed like MC Hammer. And that is the premise of Revolution X, another acclaimed game that was sold as a conversion kit for the T2 cabinet. I would love to say that I have fond memories of playing the original T2 arcade game, but for whatever reason, the proprietor of my local movie theater decided that a game about Aerosmith made more sense in a multiplex lobby than a game about one of the most successful motion pictures in history, but he couldn't be bothered to replace the cabinet art, so I have very fond memories of the T2 cabinet, just not playing the actual game it advertised.
It's up to you now. Find our car and stop the new order.
Along Alongside Terminator 2, a brand new Terminator game arrived for personal computers in July 1991, but it wasn't actually based on the sequel. Rather than scramble to gamify all of T2's massive set pieces, one studio had the bright idea to tackle something much smaller, the first film, which hadn't actually gotten a game at that point.
In the 21st century, a weapon will be invented like no other.
The Terminator was released in 1984, a year after the entire video game industry crashed, and while it was still in pretty rough shape. Though, even if business was booming, nobody was about to greenlight a game based on a low-budget horror flick from the director of Piranha 2: The Spawning. As James Cameron would later demonstrate, from humble beginnings come great things, and that's very much true of the studio behind this ambitious Terminator PC game as well. At that point, they hadn't done much beside a handful of sports games, but that would change. The studio's name is, of course, Bethesda Softworks.
I feel so well.
These days, Bethesda is known for making massively ambitious games set in sprawling open worlds like genre-defining RPGs Fallout 3 and Skyrim. In many ways, the Terminator was the studio's first step toward developing this kind of virtual world. Upon loading up the Terminator, players have the option to play as Kyle Reese or the Terminator. Playing as the former means protecting Sarah Connor, while the latter is tasked with the titular termination. In either case, the scope of how and where players accomplish this was ridiculously ambitious for the time. The game takes place in an almost one-to-one recreation of central Los Angeles that was roughly 10 miles across. For comparison, if you convert Skyrim's map into real-world measurements, it's only about 4 miles from Markarth to Riften. Like in so many sandbox games that would follow in its stead, the player would have free reign to run or drive around, buy or steal weapons and other items, and of course, avoid the police. That said, this was 1991, so it wasn't exactly easy on the eyes. As you can see, it looks like something between Duck Hunt and a Dire Straits video. It also wasn't easy on the fingers. Later games of this ilk would let players commit Grand Theft Auto with the press of a button, but stealing a vehicle in Bethesda's first outing was only slightly less complex than hotwiring an actual car and then learning how to drive stick to get it moving. Bear in mind, this was 1991. Wolfenstein 3D was a year away, and the idea of a game where players fired a gun from a first-person perspective in a three-dimensional space was far from a surefire game mechanic, never mind doing it in a three-dimensional space that's the size of Los Angeles. Bethesda's first Terminator game did well enough to warrant a sequel, but rather than follow the Terminator with a game based on T2, the developers sidestepped the film's many narrative and technical moving parts and set the game post-Judgment Day during the war against the machines. Released just 1 year after the first game, Terminator 2029 shows noticeable graphical improvements, which were likely one benefit of its substantially narrower scope. Rather than attempt another open world, 2029 was broken up into levels. Instead of making players pick between a human or machine protagonist, 2029 gave them the best of both worlds. A member of the human resistance, outfitted with a cybernetic exoskeleton that could be armed with an arsenal of high-tech weaponry and futuristic gadgets. A year after that, Bethesda followed 2029 with the Terminator Rampage, which further narrowed the scope and scale of the experience to a much more conventional corridor-based shooter. Set entirely within a Cyberdyne Systems facility in the year 1984, players controlled a commando sent back in time by John Connor to destroy a computer that itself had been sent back in time and had begun manufacturing Terminators. Rampage was released in December 1993, arriving on store shelves just in time for the holidays. Unfortunately, anybody with a PC and an interest in shooting stuff was likely preoccupied with a little game called Doom. That came out the very same month. Not only was it a much better game, id Software had also released the first chapter for free online under the correct assumption that players would eagerly pay for the rest of it. Rampage might not have been the smash hit that Bethesda was hoping for, but its lead designer Vijay Lakshman's next project for the company would more than make up for it, a fantasy RPG called The Elder Scrolls Arena. The Elder Scrolls would go on to become Bethesda's most successful property, largely thanks to the ambitious vision of a game designer named Todd Howard.
Good to see you, my friend.
Good to see you again.
Again, yes.
Who has since become a bit of a household name, if you live in a household that has multiple swords. But before venturing off into Tamriel, Howard would carve out his own corner of the Terminator timeline. Howard's first producer credit at Bethesda was for Terminator Future Shock, which was released in 1995 but improved on the studio's previous efforts tremendously. For one, it featured an unprecedented amount of 3D assets at a time when most shooters were predominantly 2D sprites in a three-dimensional space. Even more revolutionarily, Future Shock is the first PC game that used the mouse to look around, something that Todd Howard makes no secret about.
Where you look at controls today with mouse look controls and using WSAD, this is the first PC game to ever do it.
Before you say that Bungie did it first with Marathon, that's correct, but that was also technically released on Mac, not PC. An expansion pack was planned for Future Shock, but it eventually grew into a standalone game titled Skynet. Skynet lived up to its supercomputer namesake by iterating upon its predecessor to a shocking degree, adding a multiplayer mode and refining the visuals.
Major Catherine Parker. Good to have you aboard.
Okay, so the FMV cutscenes haven't exactly aged well, but for the time, this was pretty nuts. Skynet's complex indoor environments and large outdoor areas could be explored on foot or by vehicle, giving it a sense of scale that wasn't quite as commonplace in games back in 1996. There's no saying what the state of Terminator games would have been like had Bethesda continued to develop them, but Skynet would be the studio's last use of the license. Todd Howard would shift his focus from future wars to high fantasy, acting as the project lead for the Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard, one of the most hated entries in the series. But then he would follow that up with the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, which would go on to become one of the most beloved RPGs of all time. You know what they say, no fate but what we make for ourselves. I don't know if that even applies here, but whatever. For the late 90s and early 2000s, the Terminator franchise was largely in standby mode. However, a little survival horror series had begun to infect the gaming space, Resident Evil.
Resident Evil.
While Capcom's long-running series is clearly its own thing, we'd be remiss not to mention how much it owes to James Cameron's work. At face value, Resident Evil is mainly about horror of an organic variety, or at the very least biological, so a series about shiny metal robots isn't the first thing to come to mind. But the devs at Capcom took some major cues from the team at Cyberdyne Systems. For instance, in the original Terminator, the T-800 shows up looking like a big, scary human man who pursues the heroes relentlessly until he's revealed to be something decidedly not human and eventually defeated. In Resident Evil 2, Mr. X has a similar trajectory, shedding his human disguise eventually to reveal his monstrous tyrant form. A more advanced version of this guy shows up in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis as the titular bioweapon, and producer Shinji Mikami specifically credits the T-1000 as his inspiration. It's also worth noting that much like Cameron did with T2 as well as Aliens, the Resident Evil series has had great success pivoting from horror to action, with things heating up in RE3 before exploding into the nearly perfect action horror masterpiece that is Resident Evil 4, and then perhaps getting a bit off the rails trying to further one-up that experience. But hey, making sequels to nearly perfect pieces of media is not easy, as the Terminator franchise would soon show us repeatedly.
There is no fate but what we make for ourselves.
Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines hit theaters in 2003, a decade and change after its predecessor. T2 is an impossibly tough act to follow, and T3 ultimately didn't need to exist, but after such a long time in development hell due to convoluted rights issues, it somehow got made, and it's really a miracle that it's as decent as it is. For context, the Terminator 3 Wikipedia page spends 600 words summarizing the plot of the movie, which isn't exactly straightforward, and it spends more than 4,000 words describing the amount of back and forth that took place before filming even began. Anyway, since T2, the gaming landscape had changed a fair amount, and console games were beginning to be taken more seriously as a form of entertainment for mature, discerning consumers. This might have had something to do with Arnold finally allowing his likeness to be used in the first Terminator 3 game, and based on the trailer, that was one of its biggest selling points.
For the first time ever, fight as Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Unfortunately, star power in a video game isn't enough to carry it when the rest of the experience sucks. When the Rise of the Machines video game arrived alongside the film's home video release, it got torn apart by reviewers and fans alike for its subpar graphics, loads of bugs, and AI so stupid that it kind of undermined the premise of the movie it was based on. PC players didn't have it any better. They got War of the Machines, a team-based multiplayer experience vaguely reminiscent of Battlefield 1942, but set in the post-Judgment Day wasteland. One widespread complaint was the half-baked animations, with one reviewer noting that it made sense for a Terminator to die by rigidly falling over like a wobbly store mannequin, but it was less convincing when a human did it, which bafflingly was still showcased in the official marketing materials. In 2003, developers of console and PC games might have been targeting a more discerning crowd of gamers. But for hastily produced shovelware based on any license that wasn't bolted down, the Game Boy Advance was the Wild West. However, the Game Boy Advance version of Rise of the Machines was ironically the least worst adaptation. An isometric action game, it followed a similar structure to the old T2 games. Players took control of the T-850 and fought robots in the future for several levels, and then they traveled back in time to get shot at by the LAPD instead. One really cool detail is when the T-850 takes damage, it's reflected by his sprite's appearance in-game. The lower his health, the more his metal endoskeleton is visible. However, picking up health packs makes his skin and clothing grow back, which makes absolutely zero sense if you've somehow forgotten that we're talking about a Game Boy game. A year after Rise of the Machines, Terminator 3: The Redemption was released for consoles and PC, and its title seemed more self-aware than Skynet on Judgment Day, especially after how the previous two games were received. Redemption began development around the same time as Rise and War, but was given a little bit of extra development time due to its larger scope, which it benefited from greatly. When it was released in 2004, many critics lauded it as the best Terminator game yet. Unfortunately, that's not really a high bar, and a bunch of 7 out of 10s didn't quite redeem the franchise as a viable basis for more video games without a new movie to attach themselves to. Fast forward through several more years of legal tug-of-war, and it was announced in 2007 that the Halcyon Company was the proud new owner of the Terminator franchise and had plans to produce a 4th film, which was intended to kick off a whole new trilogy. Shortly after that news, Halcyon announced the formation of Halcyon Games, who would handle the official video game tie-in in-house, ensuring that it arrived alongside the film in 2009. In some ways, Terminator Salvation the video game is a lot like Terminator Salvation the movie. It's got decent visuals, lots of explosions, almost as many robots, a somewhat forgettable story, but the overall experience could be a hell of a lot worse. In other ways, the game is nothing like the movie. John Connor looks and sounds nothing like Christian Bale, as the actor didn't lend his likeness or voice to the project. The game takes place 2 years before the events of the film, so it could have had a totally original protagonist, and it narratively wouldn't have made much of a difference. Console versions received pretty mediocre reviews, but the mobile game fared slightly better, probably thanks to its impressive scope compared to the average iOS and Android game at that time. What's most interesting about Terminator Salvation is that it marks a major sea change in Hollywood's approach to making video games based on movies. Video games were starting to be seen as a lucrative entertainment medium of their own, rather than just another form of merchandise. The results of Terminator Salvation's approach might have been middling, but it's a substantial improvement over, say, farming out the license to the highest bidder who would then turn it over to a small studio that hadn't even seen the movie they were supposed to turn into a game. Unfortunately, the Halcyon Company's halcyon days were short-lived, and they declared bankruptcy 2 years after Salvation's release. Several more years were spent wrestling over the franchise, and soon enough, Terminator Genisys rose from the ashes with lofty ambitions of rebooting the whole space-time continuum, and yes, kicking off a whole new trilogy. But no plans were made to return to the video game space, and it's not hard to see why. By 2015, the amount of time and money required to develop and market a AAA video game had begun to regularly eclipse that of your average Hollywood blockbuster. The closest thing we got to a new Terminator game in 2015 was a mode in GTA Online inspired by the film, where players driving semi-trucks had to run down bike-riding opponents in an aqueduct. The mode was appropriately titled Hasta la Vista. Alright, so full disclosure, I consider myself a pretty big Terminator fan, and I never actually got around to watching Genesys, which may make me a fake Terminator fan, but based on everything I've seen and heard since it came out, I don't feel like I'm missing out. From the jump, it looked like a cross between one of those fan-made trailers cut together from other movies and a really expensive Super Bowl ad for a free-to-play mobile game. So it's quite fitting that 2 years after the movie hit theaters, Terminator Genisys Future War was announced for mobile devices with an explosive, extremely polished, expensive-looking CGI trailer, which, like many mobile game trailers, may have oversold the actual gameplay just a tad.
Buildings are divided into 2 types: administrative and resource.
Awkwardly enough, by the time the Genesys mobile game was released, it had already been announced months earlier that the next Terminator movie was in development. Terminator Dark Fate arrived in 2019, acting as a reboot sequel hybrid that planned to pick up where T2 left off, ignore the events of all the movies released since then, and yes, once again, kick off a whole new movie trilogy. James Cameron was actually involved this time around, and Linda Hamilton was back, so it seemed promising enough.
Is Terminator in good hands with Tim Miller?
Absolutely. I mean, it's Tim Miller.
Anyway, yet again, it didn't get an official video game, at least not until Defiance, which was an RTS that was rather unstrategically released almost 5 years after everyone had done their best to forget this film existed. However, leading up to its release, Terminator Dark Fate did align itself with gaming in a major way. At E3 2019, the T800 crashed 2 press conferences. On the Xbox stage, it was revealed that the pre-order bonus for Gears of War 5 would be a whole Terminator Dark Fate character pack, allowing players to run around as Lancer-wielding T800 endoskeletons or turn Sarah Connor loose in Horde mode. Meanwhile, Ubisoft hyped up Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Breakpoint by teasing plans for Terminator DLC coming post-launch, which would introduce a whole mode that let players rage against the machines. Mortal Kombat 11, another of 2019's big games, also got Terminator DLC, with the T800 added to the roster weeks before Dark Fate hit theaters, featuring a fully fleshed out moveset and the requisite fatalities.
Get over here.
This was so well received that Mortal Kombat 11's sequel, Mortal Kombat 1, would later add the T-1000 to its roster. Given Mortal Kombat's inscrutably tangled timeline and irreparably mangled spinal columns, it stands to reason that a couple of time-traveling murder robots would make a good fit. In the years since Dark Fate, not to promote any movie in particular, Terminator characters have made guest appearances in Fortnite and Call of Duty where they fit in a lot better than plenty of DLC crossovers that have popped up since.
In the writer's room, we called them slow bullets.
Dark Fate's director Tim Miller got his start producing video game trailers with Blur Studios, and it's likely he was fully in support of this kind of brand synergy, if not partially responsible for how heavily this film aligned itself with gaming. Sadly, Dark Fate's title turned out to be as prophetic as the frantic warnings of a naked man from the future, and it bombed at the box office, vaporizing any chance of a sequel anytime soon. Weirdly enough, a substantial Terminator game was released alongside Dark Fate, but it had nothing to do with that movie, presumably for boring legal reasons. If there's one thing more convoluted than the Terminator continuity, it's who owns the rights to it at any given time. My understanding is that a publisher named Reef Entertainment secured the rights to make games based on Terminator and Terminator 2 way back in 2013, but not on any of the other films. And by the way, they're the ones who were publishing Terminator 2D No Fate, the game that's the whole reason we decided to make this long video in the first place. Anyway, Terminator Resistance was announced in September 2019 with a November 2019 release date. Generally, this short of a turnaround between the announcement and launch of a game is cause for skepticism, and that goes double when it's based on a movie license that's had as many bad games as this one has. Now tack on the fact that it was developed by Teon, the studio behind the infamous Rambo the video game, and you can see why gamers might have steered clear. If you're unfamiliar, Rambo is one of the worst reviewed games of 2014. On Metacritic, out of hundreds of games released that year, it is the 7th lowest scored by critics and the 5th lowest scored based on user reviews. Upon launch, Terminator Resistance was slightly better received, generally being lauded as mediocre, in some cases flat out bad. Also, let the record show that I did not review that game for IGN. However, you can't say Resistance wasn't trying. In addition to having a clear respect for the source material, this little AA game was juggling more complex systems than anyone was likely expecting. In addition to shooting robots, it's also got crafting, stealth, side quests, and multiple romance options, with sex scenes and everything. Is it a little bit janky? Yes! Low budget? Definitely! Surprisingly horny? You betcha! But you know what else was? The original 1984 film that kicked off this entire franchise. Since Resistance was first released, the team at Teon dropped an enhanced version and a handful of DLC, and have since amassed quite a following of players evangelizing all the stuff that this game does right. As a follow-up, Teon tackled yet another beloved 80s cyberpunk cult classic with RoboCop Rogue City. Again, nobody was expecting much, but Rogue City improves considerably on what Resistance was attempting, while still maintaining that same palpable appreciation for the source material. It's a little bit janky, but it also kicks ass and it's unexpectedly funny. Just like RoboCop. Obviously you walk around and shoot a bunch of bad guys in the crotch, but there's also a side quest where RoboCop has to stand behind a desk in the police station and respond to outlandish citizen complaints to uphold the public trust, which is one of his prime directives. These guys understood their prime directives, so whatever 80s movie Teon announces they're turning into a video game next, keep an eye on it. Anyway, speaking of RoboCop, as I'm prone to do, that's the perfect excuse to talk about RoboCop versus the Terminator, which I should have talked about sooner, but this franchise isn't chronological, so why should this video be? Released in 1993 for almost all the handhelds and consoles on the market at the time, this delightful crossover was based on the Dark Horse Comics miniseries written by Frank Miller, who, fun fact, also wrote RoboCop 2 and 3. Anyway, there's not much in the way of a story in the video game beyond RoboCop shooting a bunch of bad guys and T-800s and gold T-800s and then a really big T-800, but the music absolutely slaps and periodically just says Terminator for no reason. Also, when you start the game up on Sega, RoboCop says, "Excellent." Excellent. Man, how cool would a modern RoboCop versus Terminator be? If only there was some studio that had experience making Terminator and RoboCop games and had a bunch of screen-accurate assets lying around they could just mash together into something fun and violent. After all, there have been much weirder combinations, like, say, Terminator and chess. Yep, they did that in 1993 as well with Terminator 2 Chess Wars, which was probably very exciting when it came out because everyone was terrified of chess computers, as they were some of the most intelligent AI in existence back then. I don't know if that's actually true, but they made a movie about Bobby Fischer, so chess was hot, I think. If you prefer PE to math class, you might also prefer Terminator and wrestling. Yep, that was a whole thing in WWE 2K16. Despite not wanting his likeness used in dozens of Terminator games based on Terminator movies that he was in, Schwarzenegger not only signed off on it appearing here, he also agreed to recreate the whole opening scene of T2 where he walks naked into the biker bar, but this time they had WWE superstars playing all the bikers. Wow, they must have paid Arnold the big bucks for that. Hey, speaking of big bucks, did you know there's a Terminator mode in Big Buck Hunter? That's right, there is. You shoot Terminators instead of deer. You probably could have put that together yourself. What does the future hold? Well, it may involve us banding together to scrounge for resources and fight for our lives in a scorched wasteland wrought by artificial intelligence. Worst case scenario, we're doing that in real life, but more optimistically, we're doing that in the open world game Terminator Survivors, which was announced almost 2 years ago, but which keeps getting kicked down the road with no major updates. So who knows when or if we'll ever get to see it in action. In the meantime, we've got Terminator 2D No Fate to keep us busy, which as of shooting this video, I haven't actually had a chance to play. The future is not written, and neither are the reviews for this game, but on the bright side, unlike trying to make a movie that's better than T2, making the best Terminator game ever isn't really as high of a bar. Really, the bar is quite low. You might even say the bar is basically on the floor. So there you have it. That is most of the games based on the Terminator films featuring Terminator characters or somehow loosely connected to this storied franchise. I skipped over a few, so let me know in the comments what probably mediocre game based on this partially incredible movie series is worth mentioning. If you enjoyed this video, go watch our deep dives on the best, worst, and weirdest games based on The Simpsons and Dragon Ball, and if that doesn't cut it, check out my 17-minute long dissertation on video game chainsaws. And with that, thanks for watching, and in the words of a very wise teenager,
Hasta la vista, baby.